Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's continue with a charming look at nature and history, with more from The Story of a Boulder, or Gleanings from the Notebook of a Field Geologist by Archibald Geikie of the Geological Survey of Great Britain. Illustrated with woodcuts. First published in 1858 by Thomas Constable & Co., printer to Her Majesty, Edinburgh, and Hamilton Adams & Co., London. Let's pick up right where we left off in the middle of Chapter 2 and our exploration of the glacial age. Let's begin. The visible portion of an iceberg is only about 1/9 part of the real bulk of the whole mass, so that if one be seen 100 feet high, its lowest peak may perhaps be away down 800 feet below the waves. Now it is easy to see that such a moving island will often grate across the summit and along the sides of submarine hills. And when the lower part of the berg is roughened over with earth and stones, the surface of the rock over which it passes will be torn up and dispersed, or smoothed and striated, while the boulders embedded in the ice will be striated in turn. But some icebergs have been seen rising 300 feet over the sea, and these, if their submarine portion sank to the maximum depth, must have reached the enormous total height of 2,700 feet. That is, rather higher than the Cheviot Hills. By such a mass, any rock or mountaintop existing 2,400 feet below the surface of the ocean would be polished and grooved, and succeeding bergs depositing mud and boulders upon it, this smooth surface might be covered up and suffer no change until the ocean bed should be slowly upheaved to the light of day. In this way, submarine rock surfaces at all depths, from the coastline down to 2,000 or 3,000 feet, may be scratched and polished and eventually entombed in mud. And such has been the origin of the deep clay, which, with its included and accompanying boulders, covers so large a part of our country. When this Arctic condition of things began, the land must have been slowly sinking beneath the sea. And so, as years rolled past, higher and yet higher zones of land were brought down to the sea level, where floating ice, coming from the northwest, stranded upon the rocks and scored them all over as it grated along. This period of submergence may have continued until even the highest peak of the Grampians disappeared, and after suffering from the grinding action of ice-freighted rocks, eventually lay buried in mud far down beneath a wide expanse of sea, over which there voyaged whole argosies of bergs. When the process of elevation began, the action of waves and currents would tend greatly to modify the surface of the glacial deposit of mud and boulders, as the ocean bed slowly rose to the level of the coastline. In some places the muddy envelope was removed, and the subjacent rock laid bare, all polished and grooved. In other localities, currents brought in a continual supply of sand or washed off the boulder mud and sand and then redeposited them in irregular beds. Hence resulted those local deposits of stratified sand and gravel so frequently to be seen rusting over the boulder clay. At length, by degrees, the land emerged from the sea. Yet glaciers still capped its hills and choked its valleys. But eventually a warmer and more genial climate arose. Plants and animals, such as those at present amongst us, and some, such as the wolf, no longer extant, were ere long introduced. And eventually, as lord of the whole, man took his place upon the scene. It is pleasant to mark, when once the true solution of a difficulty is obtained, how all the discordant elements fall one by one into order, and how every new fact elicited tends to corroborate the conclusion. In some parts of the glacial beds, there occur regular deposits of shells which must have lived and died in the places where we find them. From 10 to 15% of them belong to species which are extinct. That is to say, have not been detected living in any sea. Some of them are still inhabitants of the waters around our coasts, but the large majority occur in the northern seas. They are emphatically northern shells and get smaller in size and fewer in number as they proceed southward, till they disappear altogether. In like manner, the palm, on the other hand, is characteristically a tropical plant. It attains its fullest development in intertropical countries, getting stunted in its progress towards either pole, and ceasing to grow in the open air beyond the 38th parallel of latitude in the southern hemisphere, and the 45th in the northern. So too the ivy, which in our country hangs out its glossy festoons in every woodland, and around the crumbling walls of abbey and castle and tower, is nursed in the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg as a delicate and favorite exotic. In short, the laws which regulate the habitat of a plant or an animal are about as constant as those which determine its form. There are indeed exceptions to both. We may sometimes find a stray vulture from the shores of the Mediterranean, gorging itself on sheep and lambs among the wolds of England, just as we often see a double cherry seeming parted, but yet a union in partition. Or as we hear of a sheep with 5 legs and a kid with 2 heads. But these exceptions from their comparative rarity only make the laws more evident. When therefore we find in various parts of our country beds of shells in such a state of preservation as to lead us to believe that the animals must have lived and died where their remains are now to be seen, we justly infer that the districts where they occur must at one period have been submerged. If the shells belong to freshwater species, it is plain that they occur on the site of an old lake. If they are marine, we conclude that the localities where they are found, no matter how high above the sea, must formerly have stood greatly lower, so as to form the ocean bed. To proceed one step further, if the shells are of a southern type, that is, if they belong to species which are known to exist only in warmer seas than our own, we pronounce that at a former period the latitudes of Great Britain must have enjoyed a more temperate and genial climate, so as to allow southern shells to have a wider range northwards. If, on the other hand, they are of an Arctic or boreal type, we in the same way infer that our latitudes were once marked by a severer temperature than they now possess, so as to permit northern shells to range farther southwards. This reasoning is strictly correct, and the truth involved forms the basis of all inquiries into the former condition of the earth and its inhabitants. The evidence furnished by the northern shells in the Boulder clay series is, accordingly, of the most unmistakable kind. These organisms tell us that at the time they lived, our country lay sunk beneath a sea, such as that of Iceland and the North Cape, over which many an iceberg must have journeyed. And thus they corroborate our conclusions, derived independently from the deep clay and boulder beds and the striated rock surfaces, as to the glacial origin of the Boulder clay. Chapter 3. The scratched and grooved surface of the boulder was produced when it was fast frozen in some iceberg and driven gratingly across some submarine summit or stranded on some rocky coastline. But from its rounded form, the stone had evidently undergone a long process of wear and tear previous to its glacial journey. Probably it had hitherto lain along a surf-beaten beach, where in the course of ages it had gradually been worn into its present rounded shape. But how came it there? It must originally have formed part of a flat sandstone bed, with many other beds piled above it. By what agency, then, was this great pile reduced to fragments? The answer to these questions must be a somewhat lengthened one, for the subject relates not to a few beds of rock, hastily broken up and dispersed, but to the physical changes of an entire country, carried on during a vast succession of geological periods. A phenomenon known familiarly as crag and tail has long been connected in its origin with the drift of boulder beds. Has my reader ever traveled through central Scotland? If so, he must often have noticed the abrupt, isolated form of many of the hills, presenting a mural front to the west and a long, sloping declivity to the east. From the great number of isolated, hard trap rocks in this region, the phenomenon is much better seen than in most other parts of the kingdom. There is, for instance, the Castle Rock of Stirling, with its beetling crag and castellated summit, which presents so imposing a front to the west. Many other examples are seen along the line of the Edinburgh and Glasgow Railway, the range of hills south of Linlithgow, the singularly abrupt basalt of Binney Crag, the long, rounded ridge of Ratho, the double-peaked crag of Dalmahoy, the broad undulation of woody Corstorphine, are all examples more or less marked. Edinburgh itself is an excellent illustration. The Calton Hill shows a steep front to the town, while its eastern side slopes away down to the sea. Arthur's Seat, in like manner, has a precipitous western face and a gentle declivity eastward. The Castle Rock, too, shoots up perpendicularly from the valley that girdles it on the north, west, and south, sinking away to the east in a long slope, whose ridgy back heaves to the sky, piled deep and massy, close and high. East Lothian presents several well-marked instances, in particular North Berwick Law and Terrain. A phenomenon so general must have had some general origin, and it was accordingly attributed to the same agency which produced the drift clays and the striated rock surfaces, when these were believed to be the results of great diluvial action. It would seem, however, that the phenomenon of crag and tail should not be associated with the Boulder clay. The latter is undoubtedly a newer tertiary formation, but the denudation which produced crag and tail must have been going on long ere the tertiary ages had begun. There is satisfactory evidence that large areas of our country were planed down at a greatly more ancient period than that of even the oldest of the tertiary series. Thus the whole area of the county of Sussex suffered a very extensive denudation during the latter secondary ages. The Hebrides had undergone a similar process previous to the deposition of the Lias and Oolite, and the Greywacke Hills of South Scotland previous to the formation of the Old Red Sandstone. There seems thus to have been a general and continuous process of degradation at work during a long succession of geological ages. The results of this long-continued action are of the most startling kind. I have referred to the phenomenon of crag and tail as perhaps the most readily observable. We must not fail to remember that the crag which now stands up so prominently above the level of the surrounding country at one period lay buried beneath an accumulation of sandstone, shale, or other strata, all of which have been carried away so as to leave the harder rock in bold relief, with a portion of the less coherent strata sloping as a long tail from its eastern side. The crag, too, is often breached in many places, worn down at one end, rounded on the summit, and sometimes well nigh ground away altogether, whilst in front there is invariably a deep hollow scooped out by the current when arrested by the abrupt cliff. In Figure 2, A represents a crag of greenstone, worn away and bared of the shales which once covered it. B, the sloping tail of softer strata, protected from abrasion by the resistance of the trap rock and covered by a deep layer of drift. D. C marks the hollow on the west side of the crag. But when we come to measure the actual amount of material that has been carried away, we are lost in conjecture as to the vastness of the time which such a process must have occupied. For instance, the coal-bearing strata of Mid-Lothian must at one period have been connected with those of Linlithgow and Stirling. At a subsequent date, the western area subsided to form the Stirlingshire coal basin, and the eastern area, in like manner, sank down to form the coal basin of Mid-Lothian, while the intermediate portion stretched from east to west as a great arch, or, as it is termed geologically, an anticlinal axis. Now the whole of this arch has been worn away, not a vestige of it remains, and yet its upper or coal-bearing part was fully 3,000 feet thick. Let us take a small portion of this district and endeavor to calculate the amount of matter thus removed. The Pentland Hills form a chain stretching from near Edinburgh for some 14 miles southward and having an average breadth of about 2.5 miles. They are formed chiefly of feldspathic trap rocks, resting upon and interstratified with conglomerate apparently of old red age, which in turn lies upon vertical Silurian slates. Before the Carboniferous strata were thrown down by successive faults, they must have covered these hills completely to a depth of not less than 6,000 feet. From this small area, therefore, stratified sandstones, shales, limestones, and coal must have been removed to the enormous extent of 1,854,464 millions of cubic feet. But perhaps the most striking instances of denudation in the British Isles are the three famous Rossshire Hills, Chulven, Colmore, and Colvec. They are formed of piles of sandstone beds like tiers of regular masonry, and reach a height of 3,000 feet over the sea. The sandstone of which they are composed must once have formed a bed or set of beds fully 2,000 feet thick that covered the whole district for many miles around. Yet of this extensive deposit, there now exist only a few isolated fragments. I have watched the sunshine and shadow of an autumn sky resting alternately on these strange pyramidal hills, as they towered in their giant proportions like the last remnants of a mighty rampart that had stood the brunt of a long siege, and breached at last in many places, had been all but leveled to the ground. How long continued and how potent must the agency have been which could cut down and disperse the massive barrier that flanked the western coast of Ross to a height of 2,000 feet. The Hebrides are but the shattered relics of an old land that had its mountain peaks and its glens, its streams and lakes, and may have nursed in its solitude the red deer and the eagle, but was never trodden by the foot of man. A glance at the map is enough to convince us of this. We there see islands and peninsulas and promontories and deep bays and long retiring inlets, as though the country had been submerged and only its higher points remained above water. The conviction is impressed more strongly upon us by a visit to these shores. We sail through the windings of one of the sounds, and can scarcely believe that we are on the bosom of the salt sea. Hills rise on all sides, and the water, smooth as a polished mirror, shows so pure and limpid that in the sunshine we can see the white pebbles that strew its bed many fathoms down. The eastern shore is often abruptly interrupted by long receding locks, edged round with lofty mountains. And thus, where we had looked to see a deep heathy glen, with perchance a white tree-shaded mansion in the far distance, and a few dun smoking cottages in front, we are surprised to catch a glimpse of the white sails of a yacht or the darker canvas of the herring boats. We sail on, and soon a sudden turn brings us abruptly to the mouth of the Sound, a bold headland studded around with rocky islets rises perpendicularly from the sea, bleak and bare, without a bush or tree or the faintest trace of the proximity of man. The broad swell of the Atlantic comes rolling in among these rocks and breaks in foam against the gray cliffs overhead. In tempest, such a scene must be of the most terrific kind. Woe to the hapless vessel that is sucked into the vortex of these breakers, whose roar is sometimes heard at the distance of miles. Even in the calmest weather, the white surf comes surging in, and a low, sullen boom is ever reverberating along the shore. We see the harder rocks protruding far into the sea, and often pierced with long twilight caves, while the softer ones are worn into deep clefts or hollowed out into open bays strewed over with shingle. The sunken rocks and islets, scarcely showing their tops above water, were all evidently at one time connected, for as we recede from the shore, we can mark how the process of demolition goes on. There is first the projecting ness or promontory, well nigh severed from the mainland, but still connected by a rude arch, through which the swell ever gurgles to and fro. Then a little farther from the shore, a huge isolated crag, washed on all sides by the surge, raises its gray lichen-clothed summit. A short way beyond, there is the well-worn islet, whose surface shelters neither lichen nor seaweed, but is ever wet with the dash of the waves. Further to the sea, the white gleam of the breakers marks the site of the sunken rock. Thus, in the space of 100 yards, we may sometimes behold the progress of change from land to sea, and see before us a specimen of that action which slowly, but yet steadily, has narrowed and breached the outline of our western shores. If we attempt to trace the connections of strata among the Hebrides, we shall be more fully impressed with the magnitude of the changes which have been effected. Thus the lias and oolite occur in patches along the shores of Mull, Morven, Ardnamurchan, Ake, Skye, Raasay, and Applecross. But though now only in patches, these formations must once have extended over a considerable area, for they seem to form the under rock of the whole of the northern part of Skye, and are seen in almost every lone island, from Ardnamurchan Point to the Sheant Isles. These scattered portions, often many miles distant from each other, are the remnants of a great sheet of liassic and oolitic strata, now almost entirely swept away, and are extant from having been covered over with hard trap rocks. But for these, it may be doubted whether we should ever have known that corals once gleamed white along the shores of Skye, that the many-chambered ammonite swam over the site of the Coolin Hills, that the huge reptilian monsters of these ancient times, ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, careered through the waters that laved the gray hills of slate, and that forests of zamia and cycas, and many other plants indicative of a warm climate, bloomed green and luxuriant along the site of that strange mist-clad cliff line. It is curious to reflect that the records of these peaceful scenes have been preserved to us by the devastating eruptions of volcanic forces, that the old lava streams which spread death through the waters along whose bed they traveled have yet been the means of protecting the districts which they wasted, while those parts where they did not reach have been long since swept away. It is allowable to believe that in the portions of liassic strata which have been destroyed, there existed the remains of not a few species, perhaps some genera, to be found nowhere else, and of whose former existence there is now by consequence no trace. In the small island of Papa, a relic of the Scottish lias, I found 31 species, of which Dr. Wright has pronounced 4 to be new. A subsequent visit to the adjacent island of Rasse has increased the list. In short, every patch of these secondary rocks, if thoroughly explored, might be found to yield its peculiar organisms, and in the far larger area that has been carried away, there existed doubtless many more. We are accustomed to see individuals perish and their remains crumble away, but the species still holds on. In the stratified portion of the Earth's crust, however, we mark how not merely individuals have perished, but whole genera and species. But of these, the remains are still before us in the rocks. We can study their forms, and from a comparison with recent species and genera, can arrive at some idea of their nature and functions. In this way, we are able to picture the various conditions of the earth when these organisms lived in succession upon its surface. Yet, we may readily conjecture that in ancient eras, many tribes and genera of plants and animals lived for ages and then passed away without leaving any record of their existence. Many circumstances might concur to prevent the preservation of their remains. The species of the Hebrides were preserved in the usual manner, but the cemetery in which their remains were entombed has been washed away, and they can be seen nowhere else. It is as if on some isolated country there had lived a race of men, tall Patagonians or diminutive Laplanders. Owing to some change of climate, the race gradually dwindled down until it died out. Eventually, too, the land settled down beneath the sea with all its ruined cities and villages, which, as they reached in succession the level of the waves, were torn up and dispersed, and other races at last voyaged over the site of that old land, dreaming not that in bygone years fellow mortals of an extinct type had pastured their herds where now there rolled a widespread sea. But to return, we have seen that the long-continued action of the sea has been sufficient to breach and waste away the existing coastline of western Scotland. When, therefore, such results are produced by so ordinary a cause, need we go to seek the agency of great debacles to explain the denudation of other parts of the country? It is known that at great depths, currents have little effect upon the rocks which they traverse, and that their action is greater as it nears the surface. To account for the phenomena of crag and tail and the general denudation of the country, we must suppose the land to have been often submerged and re-elevated. As hill after hill rose towards or sank below the sea level, it would be assailed by a strong current that flowed from the west and northwest, until in its slow upward or downward progress, it got beyond the reach of the denuding agencies. In this way, the general contour of the land would be greatly, though very gradually, changed. Hills of sandstone or other material of feeble resistance would be swept away. The harder trap rocks would stand up bared of the strata which once covered them. Deep hollows would be excavated in front of all the more prominent eminences, and long declivities would be left behind them. If my reader has ever visited the channel of a mountain torrent, imbris quern super notus anluria repus, he must have noticed an exact counterpart to these appearances. When the waters have subsided, the overflowed parts are seen to be covered in many places with sand. Wherever a pebble occurs along the surface of this sand, it has invariably a hollow before it on the side facing the direction whence the stream is flowing, and a long tail of sand pointing down the channel. If we watch the motion of the water along its bed, the denuding agency may be seen actively at work. Every pebble that protrudes above the shallow streamlet arrests the course of the current, which is then diverted in 3 directions. One part turns off to the right hand of the pebble and cuts away the sand from its flank. Another part strikes off to the left and removes the sand from that side, while a middle part descends in front of the pebble, and by a kind of circular or gyratory movement scoops out a hollow in the sand in front. Behind the pebble, the water is pretty still, so that the sand remains undisturbed, and is further increased by the accumulation above it of sediment swept round by the lateral currents. Now, in place of the supposed stream, let us substitute the ocean with its westerly current. For the pebble, a great trap hill. For the sand, easily friable shales and sandstones, and we have exactly the condition of things which produced crag and tail. This process of destruction must have been in progress during many geological ages. We may suppose that in that time the land often changed level, sometimes rising far above the sea and sometimes sinking deep below it. We can well believe that the surface would often be covered with vegetation, that plants, widely differing from those which are now indigenous, clothed its hillsides and shaded its valleys, and that animals of long extinct forms roamed over its plains or prowled amidst its forests. When the country, in the lapse of centuries, sank beneath the sea level, all trace of these scenes would eventually be effaced. The westerly currents would soon recommence the process of degradation, uprooting the forests, devastating the plains, wearing down the hills, and scooping out the valleys. And so, when the ocean bed, in the course of ages, became again dry land, it would arise another and yet the same. The little valley, where once perchance the mastodon used to rest his massive bulk amid a rich growth of ferns, shaded by the thick umbrage of coniferous trees, would emerge a deep glen with bare and barren rocks on either side, the site of the hill whereon herds of the gazelle-like anoplothere were wont to browse, might reappear on level plain. The low-browed rock, under whose shadow the ungraceful paleothere used of old to rest from the heat of the noontide sun, might emerge a beetling crag shooting up several 100 feet over the valley. It is by this repeated elevation and submergence, carried on for many ages, that our country has acquired its present configuration. We can easily picture to ourselves the appearance which the British Islands would thus at different periods present. At one time, nearly the whole of England would be under water, with, however, a few islands representing the higher peaks of Cornwall, others scattered over the site of the West Riding of Yorkshire, and a hilly tract of land over what is now Wales. Scotland must have existed in a sorely mutilated state. A thick-set archipelago would represent the Cheviot Hills and the country south of the Forth and the Clyde, north of which there would intervene a broad strait, with a comparatively large area of undulating land beyond, stretching across what is now the area of the Grampian Hills. A narrow fjord would run along the site of the Caledonian Canal, cutting the country into two parts, and running far into it on either side as deep locks and bays. I have had such a condition of things vividly recalled when on the summit of a lofty hill in early morning, while the mists were still floating over the lower grounds, and only the higher hilltops, like so many islands, rose above the sea of cloud. It was not a little interesting to cast the eye athwart this changing scene, and mark how each well-known peak and eminence looked when deprived of its broad sweep of base. What before had always seemed an abrupt, precipitous summit now took the form of a lonely rock or deep-sea stack that might have served as a haunt for the gull and the gannet. The long, swelling hill rose above the mist as a low, undulating island, treeless and barren. It was easy to think of that wide expanse of mist as the veritable domain of ocean, to picture the time when these were veritable islands lashed by the surge, and to conjure up visions of ice floes drifting through the narrows or stranding on the rocks amid a scene of widespread nakedness and desolation. And with those evocative images of a long-lost past and the end of Chapter 3, I think we'll end this evening's reading from The Story of a Boulder, or Gleanings from the Notebook of a Field Geologist. I confess I love these mid-19th century naturalist books. It's wonderful to see these writers reveling in the new sciences of the 19th century and applying them to the world all around them. What a joy to read this book, which was recommended by one of your fellow listeners. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the diagrams described, As always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.